Hey everybody, my name is Robbie Lockman with Harness. Today I have my buddy Josh here from Accelino. Josh, thanks for having me on at the Fireside
Absolutely.
Chat.
Yeah, absolutely, Ravi. I'm Josh from Accelino, director and one of the co-founders, and we're a premier partner of Harness. We wanted to have Ravi on because Ravi is a big proponent of obviously what Harness does, but it's really about what they solve. So much so that Harness did a study, talked with a lot of organizations around CI, CD, and really what they're trying to achieve. And not only what they're trying to achieve, how have they gone about trying to achieve it, but also looking at some of the things that organizations struggle with when it comes to continuous integration and continuous deployment. We're really going to focus on continuous deployment today, but as we all know, that's really part of everything with a DevOps tool chain. So, Ravi, I think we just dive right in. You know, you're the master of this report, so I want to ask you some questions
Sure.
and really talk about what you see, and then also what we see, being a professional services company, but also a Harness partner, and how we're helping customers address a lot of the things that are in your report because they're not uncommon findings across a lot of different organizations. So if we dive right in, right, I think to really kind of take a step back, companies are adopting DevOps practices, they're deploying more often, and that's great. However, I feel as though we always say CI/CD, but a lot of times when we hear organizations say that, they immediately are just going to focus in on CI, right? That continuous integration, and that CD, that continuous deployment, kind of gets left behind. What we see is with a lot of organizations is we'll do CI first and then we'll get to CD, which I think is a bit odd, because as part of doing CI, you've got to go through the different environments. You got to go through testing. You eventually got to make it to production. So they do all this CI and then they kind of manually still doing deployments, and we'll get into that. But and we know again that CI CD piece is a part of the DevOps journey. There's a lot of things in that journey that's the same and different for every organization. But what we see is when people start to pick up on, organizations really pick up on CI, but then they really struggle with CD. And the question is, why do they struggle with this, right? Why do they struggle with that deployment frequency? Why do they struggle with the lead time as it comes to deployments? And then what also is a big thing is the time to recover from a failure, because that happens, right? That happens especially out in production. And as we all know, we break things down into smaller microservices and everything else. There's more things to manage, so that mean time to recover is becoming far more important, especially as we become far more connected from a business standpoint. So today I want to really kind of talk about three topics that are interlaced together with the CI and again, really the CD. So the first one is around building a pipeline. So in the report, the average time needed to build a deployment is roughly about 66 hours. So we'll say somebody working on it full-time, dedicated, 11 days, because, right, 8 hours in a working day, but most people roughly work 6. So, 11 days. And here's the thing, you may think, well, that's not that big of a deal. You do that once and then you really don't have to keep doing that. But what we see is there's a lot of custom scripts. And what do we all know about custom scripts? They become brittle, they become inflexible, and the key piece is they lack templatization, right? It's hard to rinse and repeat for maybe different groups or different projects, and now everybody has to do it a little bit differently. So my question is, while you need to start somewhere, why is it really important to start with a solution to really reduce the time to build a pipeline, but also making sure that it's robust, flexible, and scalable?
Yeah, excellent question. I think it's just kind of like back at the beginning of your introduction, you kind of mentioned, I think a lot of people have, it's like an eponym, like saying Coca-Cola. I live in Georgia, so every soda is called Coke. So like, it's like an eponym, right? You say CI/CD for both continuous integration and, continuous deployment and delivery. But if you take a look at what those two domains are, uh, I've probably in my career, I've probably been on about a dozen development teams, as kind of ratcheting up the level of responsibility every time, kind of like go team to team. And building software, you can take that team to team. Like there's only so many ways that you can build a Java application, right? There's only so many ways you can build a Go app. It's like go build or Maven install, right?
Yeah.
Like that, there are similar patterns that you take language to language. Uh, in the 12 teams I've been on, I have deployed the software differently every single time. So taking those learnings that I've had, like you learn different approaches, but no one's approach is the same, which takes time to learn, right? So organization A is different than B, that's different than X, because there's a couple of reasons for that. When we're doing a deployment, it's a culmination of many different skill sets, right? So let's say you and I were on a team, there would be several more people that we'd have to deal with. So you have different functional domains that are coming together probably for the first time. And so a lot of people are kind of estimating like, hey, like what is, let's say you were the operations engineer and I'm a developer, I would have to estimate what you're doing, even though it's something I've never done before, to give you some sort of steps. And vice versa, you would be giving me steps to do that you probably didn't have a direct interaction with when we created it. And so it's actually ironically very human centric of a task. And automating anything that has multiple domains, multiple, as people, we have multiple emotions about certain things and multiple pieces of expertise. It is fairly difficult, right? So back to that point, the report that Josh is talking about, we usually, so at Harness, we're a continuous delivery as a service company. And so when we go and talk to prospects and customers, we actually do a capability assessment. It's called a CDCA, so Continuous Delivery Capability Assessment. And so recently we aggregated, we probably did over 120 of them, but in the report, we took the first 100 that we did and aggregated. So we have this Continuous Delivery Insights report. And what we've seen is that on average, during pipeline creation, the amount of effort, at least to sort of basic, so we say pipeline, that's automation of certain steps, it's 66 hours, which it's like 11 days, right? Because basically when you're automating or trying to start down the automation journey, you're building an application. Like literally that's it, right? You have multiple decision points, you have a workflow. And so 66 is on the low side, right? We had folks that have taken way longer than that. So that's just a midpoint, right? Depending on, that's the 50 percentile. So on average, it takes 11 days, but there's definitely outliers in both, just depending on how mature an organization is and how used to they're doing that. And it takes time. Like to Josh's point, I think a lot of people would tend to wrap scripts up. I'll pose this question. For any application dev team, have you ever just made an application and left? Open-ended question, right? Like most of the IT spend is in maintenance, right? Like after the inception, you have version 1 out. That's not the final version. You have 1.1, 1.2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to the end of time until you retire the application, right? Like there's constant maintenance going on. And so similarly, there's constant maintenance going on in your pipelines and scripts. You decide to make changes of infrastructure. You decide to change how you deploy. You try to make tweaks. There's just a bunch of redundancy or a bunch of repetitive steps, because like any application, how do you regression test your pipeline, right? Like, are you disciplined enough to do that? And kind of just baking in one more point there, it's kind of the boating of two worlds. I'll always sorry to pigeonhole Josh as a system engineer here, but it's as a software engineer, like I'm used to running test suites. I'm used to iteration, and so a lot of times you take a look at who's actually in charge of the automation. It might be a system engineer that they're only used to production, so there's no iteration in their workflow. Like they get it right the first time, or it's game over as an operations engineer. Versus like now, when you're looking at continuous delivery pipelines, it's very similar to software engineering. Like you need to bundle in iteration. So continuous delivery requires iteration to enable iteration. Like the big thing about a continuous delivery pipeline is that you need to enable the successes and failures. And I think that a lot of people actually miss the failures. Like if I were to write something like right now, and I was under the gun, I would get the happy path correct, right? Like, okay, we always will succeed, but we know that it takes longer to determine the failures, right? Like the more experienced of an engineer you become, the bigger the scope is for the failure cases, right? Like, okay, like the happy path might happen 10%, but what about the other 90%? And that goes back to the core of your question. Like having a solution that does both of that. So building a pipeline by convention, running a pipeline by convention, enforcing failure points by convention, and it is building that. It's fairly critical, right? Because you will make changes, but it's the happy path is the happy path. You look across multiple tool sets. It's when you start getting into the gray and red and orange areas that there's failures, there's decisions that have to be made. That's why having a robust platform, so, shameless self-promotion like Harness, really comes in. Like it's really at those use cases that we really start to shine.
No, I think that's important because what I remember, when I was very much hands-on years ago, being a part of the different teams and working with different customers, and working with my consultants now, seeing what they're going through. Everybody's a little bit different, and the experience of the developers or the operations team and who does what definitely determines what does the release look like. And one thing that I've seen that is consistent is as you go up in the environments, the release process gets far more complex. For instance, is especially when you get into production, I always like to think that's going to be the most complex. You've probably got, let's say, load balancers and things like that. You got to take out, if you're in a traditional environment and you're not in a Kubernetes-based environment. So you've got to take things and redirect traffic, and you've got to update things, and you've got to then smoke test before you put them back in. And usually you do this, off hours. And you've got to kind of go through and do all of that. And so the more complex it is, there's more points of that failure, like you said, and say, hey, how do we learn from this? So when you look at it, but if you look at it, if you're doing that through scripts, you start simple, and now you got to add more to it, and you add more to it. But the thing is that you're not templatizing. You're just saying, well, I took this script and let me copy it and change some things, and now I'm going to add a step number 2 and a step number 3 for this environment. And now all of a sudden something in the environment changes. Mm-hmm. Well, do you remember who wrote those scripts? Maybe somebody else took them over. Right. And all of a sudden it gets to a point where somebody rewrites it. And then at some point somebody's like, we'll just do it by hand because it seems like it's easier, because usually well, we got to get this out the door now. Mm-hmm. And also too, how do you test to make sure that your CD, your pipeline works in the production? Right. How do you do that? And well, the only way to do that is through another environment. And I think that goes back to what you're saying, which is you have to be able to iterate through your pipeline and through your release process to be able to allow software to be iterative. And because, I love your question. How many people have written software and then just walk away? I think that highlights something, that software is not a widget, right? It's not made once off the factory line and that's it. It's actually a living and breathing thing. Bug fixes and other things get up to date, obviously, until at some point says that's just on a budget line item now, that is just keep it running. But usually it's because it's been running for so long, so many things have already been fixed. And now, there's something, if you will, kind of new and shiny that somebody wants to build. So let me ask this, because we've seen this with our customers as well, and working with them, is they've already built pipelines. So why is it really important for them to revisit what they've already written? In other words, don't go by the sunk cost fallacy of, well, we've already done it and it's working, so we don't need to go back and look at and find maybe a better way to do our continuous deployments.
Yeah, I think it's like anything else. Have you ever solved a problem and said you're completely done? Because new ways of thinking come on board. We actually get that a lot. But when we start digging into it, it's like, oh, we already solved for continuous deployment and continuous delivery because we've been doing that for a while. So everybody's definition is different, right? So level setting that, hey, an academic definition of something might be a little bit different. So let's say you and I work for 2 different organizations. Our bar of what we say is as hey, this is the bar for this organization, is different organization. We all can't be like Amazon deploying every 6 seconds. We all can't be like Netflix. My go-to, my critique in those organizations is Netflix only has 3 or 4 concerns at massive scale. Your typical enterprise, let's say, First Bank of North Carolina, make a bank up, right? They have thousands of concerns. Yeah. Maybe 3 or 4 of them are at scale of that, but they have thousands of concerns, right? So with all of those concerns mixing together, what's the organizational bar, right? Which is hard to measure. And people, depending how long you've been there, you'll have an answer. What we typically see in 2020 across 100 sets of folks is that people average a deployment to production every 2 weeks. That going back through my career, I've definitely been much lower, I guess, longer, right? So I'm trying to figure out what part of the bar that is. Like I've been places I've been in a project 6 months and we deployed never to production versus like I've been places that, I was probably deploying every day, right? To some sort of like feature that we're deploying to in a very controlled fashion. But that's it, right? Like everybody's a little bit different. And so kind of what we like to assess is like, well, what if you had to add another app, right? Like, so the big bloom that's been going on for the last several years is microservices. Microservices, you're afforded the luxury of deployment velocity. Like, oh, if you decompose these services or decouple things, you can deploy more frequently. But guess what? You just said you could deploy more frequently. So what does it mean to like decouple something? If like you and I made like the application I like to write about is called Wine for Pets. And so it's a fake pet store that we deliver wine, Merlot, to your cat. And so like, let's say that you and I were on the Wine for Pets team. And so we decided to like split out. I mean, the quintessential thing is like split out the shopping cart. Like, everybody talks about the shopping cart microservices to like inventory and shipping validation. Like we just introduced 2 new deployments there. Like what would it take you to deploy that? And that's where people kind of quiver like, oh yeah. Like, going back to your point, like people might've touched it years ago. But that human-centric chat's like, it was such a pain for us to get in a room together and describe that. Like, it definitely will be a big change. A lot of times people are changing infrastructure too. Like, oh, you know what? We're deciding we're moving from, one public cloud vendor to another. We're introducing like Kubernetes for the first time. We're moving to different orchestrator. And so it was like, tell me about what it takes to do that. And then tell me what the subsequent like ads will be. And then this is how you start getting to, okay, it takes us like a long time to do that. And also the pipeline wise, what we see, there's 2 ends of the spectrum, which finding a happy medium is always fairly difficult. I think what a majority, I'll say like the 80 percentile of enterprises would actually prefer this. It's usually either you're completely automated, which you're hands off, like there's no human intervention. You click a button, it goes and it's deployed in some fashion, which usually is the path of least resistance, versus like there's constant manual approvals that you just don't, I used to work for an investment bank years ago, right? So like as a dev manager, it was like, I had to copy and paste like several ServiceNow tickets to do anything. And it's like usually the medium is in between, like automating everything, but the button push is usually what people strive for. And it's usually very difficult because you need like a workflow engine to do that. And again, same with Self-Plug for Harness. Like this is like where we come in, like we can address both sides of the table and even the middle of the table, which what we see is most organizations striving for. Like, like unless there's like some sort of like deviation or unless there's like something that's out of bounds, we can provide that type of coverage. Also, I'm not sure if this is kind of on point to the question. Another very, very difficult thing to do, what I've definitely lived through pretty much most of my career, is deployment validation. So I'll ask an open-ended question again. When is your deployment over? When is it over?
Yep.
And I ask that question to a lot of people. I get a myriad of replies. A going joke would be, I've definitely done it a little bit better ways, but going back to my, when I was in my mid-20s living in New York, I worked for an investment bank. We would deploy once a month to production unless there was an emergency. Then we would forego some of the change management procedures that we had. Rarely an emergency. We're pretty conservative, a lot of stuff that we did. But we would deploy at 4 p.m. on a Thursday because 5 o'clock is happy hour, and living in Battery Park, I'm not going to pay full price for alcohol. And without fail, every single month, within a couple hours, I get paged out with a notification, right, saying we have violated some sort of SLA. And your deployments are never over. Like for anybody who's delivered software before, it's like, especially as an application owner or a manager, you're like, the onus is never gone, right? It's over when the next deployment comes in, and that's it. We can retire that version. Yeah. And validation was always a problem, right? We might have some tests, but let's say you and I were on the same team again. Let's say you and I are both software engineers on the same team doing deployment. It takes experience to learn about like, hey, this is normal, this is not normal. You might grep or tail the logs, right? You might look at, your APM solution. You might look at some sort of like logging into the application, right? Like, there's lots of markers to know. And usually that's the highest part of the learning curve, learning from an engineering perspective, what is normal. And that's pretty much why it's taken, like, they don't talk about the deployment process in your interview because people shun it. Like, Yeah, we want to ask you technical questions. But one thing I regret doing, if I ever go up for like an engineering manager job again, I'm going to ask them like, how do you deploy? The first question I ask, right? So, I know I
Yeah,
went off in a tangent there, but yeah, sorry for that.
it's great because it's one of the things that we do. How do you deploy? It's one thing to say, how do you build? Oh, well, somebody checks code in and then this script runs. Okay, well, how do you deploy? Because we get a myriad of answers. Sometimes it's automated. Oh, we've got this script and oh, this thing kicks off and it does it from dev to QA. But after QA, then it's always done manually. And we're like, okay, why? Oh, well, it's too complex. And you brought up a very good point of when is your deployment over? And it's not over until the next deployment, right? Because you can only test but so much. A lot of times they test a couple of basic things and they'll test some of the new functionality and they say, okay, well, all right, we're good until the next deployment. And sometimes the deployment's far enough out, a couple of weeks go by, they let the dust settle, they're good. But if you're doing a deployment every week, well, I mean, there's a small amount. Now, if you're doing a deployment every week, you're deploying fewer changes. And I think that's one key thing is that the more often you do a deployment means you're doing smaller deployments, which means you have less interruption per deployment, which I think is really important. And something that's also very key when we think about continuous delivery is that you don't have to have these big quarterly releases because by trying to actually deploy faster, and this is what we work with customers on, by trying to deploy faster, we want to deploy smaller bits, smaller amount of bits. And that allows us to reduce the risk per deployment. But also what we have seen by focusing on being smaller, it has reduced the barrier of, well, we do it this way and it works, so why not leave it? And a lot of times customers will say, we've been doing it this way because our process is so complex, we can't automate it. And that's where we say, all right, let's take a step back and figure out how can we simplify the process. And you said, you can't automate everything. Yes, you just want to hit the button and go. But we see this in a lot of with banking and insurance and healthcare. You've got to have gates that people are saying, yes, this is good to go. You've got to hit certain criteria. And so you're going to have those manual pieces in there. But the way that we approach it is let's make it so that you can get to each of those gates as quickly as possible with as little effort as possible. And one last thing before we kind of move to the next piece, which is because we only deploy once a month or once every 2 months. So we don't need a fully automated continuous deployment process. We typically say, okay, but how long does it take you to do a deployment? How easy is it? Because just because you don't do it often doesn't mean you shouldn't automate it, because regardless of how often you're doing it, you're saving that time to focus on something else. It just happens to be that if you are saving that time and now you aren't deploying as often, you save X amount of time. But now if you deploy, let's say one more time in a year, right? You go from 4 times a year to 5 times a year, now you just save that time, 25% over original. And I think that's important too, is that sometimes you may not deploy often, but then once you get it automated, now you can deploy more often.